Hello, I'm Joe Stewart, Vice President for Governmental Affairs, the Independent Insurance Agents in North Carolina. We're getting started. People are coming into the webinar now. We'll get underway in just a few minutes, let more folks get in and get settled. And then we'll start the recap of the 2024 primary election here in North Carolina. So please stand by. Okay, again, I'm Joe Stewart, Vice President for Governmental Affairs, the Independent Insurance Agents in North Carolina. Welcome to this post-primary election webinar. We wanted to offer our members an opportunity to hear a little bit about what happened yesterday in the primary and talk a little bit about some of the dynamics that we anticipate coming up in the general election as we head towards Election Day on November 5th here in North Carolina. If you have questions at any point during the presentation, just send them to me in the chat feature here on Zoom, and I'll try to get to those as I can. As a starting point, wanted to remind everybody we are making available all of the content we produce relative to the election year on our website. It's www.iianc.com/2024 elections, video interviews with the candidates for insurance commissioner, recordings of webinars such as this, and other materials will be available in real time for our members that want to check out any information that they saw either presented or provided through an IIANC webinar or other program. Again, we're doing this webinar today after the election. We will probably do some programming with the two candidates for insurance commissioner. We'll talk a little bit about the results from yesterday's election in that race, but we'll provide content to our members so that they can hear from the candidates themselves on the issues that matter most to the independent insurance agent community here in North Carolina. I'm on the board of the Institute of Political Leadership's a longstanding nonpartisan political training program here in North Carolina as a collaborative partnership with Spectrum News. And in the course of the election years, does what are called the hometown debates. We go to secondary cities, smaller cities in North Carolina, originate a debate between candidates running for statewide office. And I've made a strong pitch that among the statewide races that are included in that program this year be the insurance commissioner's race. So we're hopeful that that comes about. And then we'll have another one of these webinars on the day after the general election, November 6th. Election day is, of course, Tuesday, November 5th, and we'll recap everything that happened in all of the state races and talk a little bit about the implications of that on the state legislature and the executive branch of state government here in North Carolina. First, let me say thank you for all of you on the webinar today that are supporters of our State Political Action Committee, IPAC. We've had some success over the last few years in raising an additional amount of money. These funds are used for our purposes in supporting state candidates, state legislative candidates of both parties that are strong and supportive on the issues that matter most to the vibrancy of the independent insurance agency business model. We've grown and have a even more ambitious goal for this year. By the end of 2024, we hope to raise $105,000 for IPAC, our state PAC. Last year, we raised a little over $95,000, meeting our goal there. But we use these resources very judiciously. The requests for contributions are made to the IIANC Governmental Affairs Committee. And so the contributions are made in consultation with your fellow agents that are thinking about what makes the most sense in terms of the issues specific to our industry and the things that this association champions on behalf of independent insurance agents. We know it's a very strong and partisan time in American political history, but we ask you to think like an insurance agent. When you support IPAC, you're supporting your industry, and the issues that are used to determine the eligibility for a particular candidate to receive an IPAC contribution are exclusive to the things that matter most to the independent insurance agents of North Carolina. So we encourage you to give at $120 and above. You get that beautiful Yeti tumbler, as you see there featured on the screen. Be able to show all your friends you're a proud supporter of IPAC. And again, we appreciate all of the support we get for our state political action committee. We also help raise money for the federal PAC. The Big I in Washington has what they call Insure PAC that supports congressional candidates for office. So again, both parties, but are aligned with this industry on key issues, federal issues that matter to the continued vibrancy of this industry. We're going to make an extra push. Last year, we raised a little over $50,000 for Insure PAC. We're hoping to get to what is called the Eagle status level, $65,000 this year. We'll be launching around the 4th of July, an intensive effort to raise money for Insure PAC. We will be raffling off a brand new Dodge Hornet, new line of cars offered by Dodge. State Senator Jim Bergen is one of our members in the General Assembly, also part owner in a Dodge dealership, has made this available to us. We'll have other prizes that will be included in that raffle, and your contribution to Insure PAC, even if you've already made a contribution, we'll count those as well. But we'll kick off this intensive campaign in July and then have the drawing at the Insure Expo in September. But keep your eyes open for information on this coming around the 4th of July. Okay, moving on to the elections. What's on the ballot? Well, the presidential contest and an open seat race for governor. There's no U.S. Senate race in North Carolina this year, so there was no primary for a U.S. Senate. 5 open seat races in the Council of State. There are asterisks there because the auditor's race was actually considered an incumbent, although the incumbent, Jessica Holmes, was just recently appointed with the resignation of the incumbent auditor, Beth Woods, who had a little kerfuffle with a state-owned vehicle, as you may recall if you follow North Carolina politics. So technically, she's an incumbent, but she's never been elected. Jessica Holmes, that is, has never been elected to the auditor's office. So even though it's kind of not an open seat race, it is kind of an open seat race. And so a similar dynamic in the Supreme Court race as well, where the incumbent had been a appellate court judge, but had not been elected to the Supreme Court. So in some ways was kind of like an incumbent, but not really an incumbent too. All 14 congressional races, districts are on the ballot this year, as well as all 170 of the state legislative seats, 50 Senate and 120 in the House. In the congressional and state legislative races, all new district maps as a result of litigation about the maps that were drawn after the 2020 census. So relatively speaking, a new set of maps, meaning even incumbents might be running in a district that's slightly different than the district they ran in just 2 years ago. So what happened? Well, yesterday we had a primary, and the turnout was about 24% of registered voters in the state of North Carolina participated, both in what's called the early in-person voting, that period of time leading up to Election Day, where you can go to a designated location and cast your ballot. And this also includes absentee ballots for which someone requested a ballot and then voted and mailed it back in. The turnout in 2020 was 31%, so we're a little behind the most recent presidential contest. Probably some explanation of that is that the fact that there was no U.S. Senate race, and so there weren't as many up-ballot, high-profile statewide races that would draw voters out. Another dynamic that's important to remember, the presidential contest, the Republicans had several candidates to choose from, even though at the point of our primary yesterday, really only Donald Trump and Nikki Haley were continuing to campaign actively for that office. Joe Biden was the only Democratic candidate that appeared on the Democratic primary ballot. So maybe the turnout wasn't as great just because people didn't feel like there were as many significant choices, and so just chose not to participate. The election results from yesterday will be certified by the county boards of elections on March 15th, and then submitted to the state board of elections for their certification on March 16th. And then the runoff for the races where there was not a winner, and we'll talk about those, of course, will be held May 14th. And so all of the precincts in North Carolina will have to reopen for that day for the races that are on the ballot for which there was not a declared winner in the primary. Some of the initial takeaways, there appeared to be a little bit of an anti-establishment mood in both parties. Democratic, principally young Democrats, worked actively against some of their incumbent Democratic candidates. Anger and frustration about a Democrat participating with the Republicans in the legislature prompted a few candidates to run against the incumbent and were supported by groups of young Democrats. On the Republican side, a little bit of some of the victories. There are a couple of surprises there, but the common theme seems to be on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, feeling about people that are in place now or a part of the established political structure, maybe not looked upon as favorably. And so but the results tell that story. The final takeaway from yesterday's results is anything in it that confirms or denies whether North Carolina continues to be a battleground state, one of a handful of American states that are considered to be competitive in the presidential contest and really matter in terms of the pursuit of electoral college votes by the two presidential candidates. A couple of statistics that came out of some exit polling that was done yesterday. You see those bar charts at the bottom of this slide. These were questions asked of people as they left the polling place yesterday. And this was the interesting dynamic. I think this is really what will matter the most in North Carolina in the fall relative to the presidential contest. Among voters that voted for a Republican candidate for president, those that voted for said in the exit poll that they had voted for Trump, 83% of those without a college degree, 83% said they voted for Trump versus 12 for Haley. Where college graduates, only 56% voted for Trump, or 41% voted for Haley. This is sort of an indication of the emerging trend in American politics where educational attainment becomes a factor that can be looked at in terms of the likely partisan and political disposition of a voter. And so for Donald Trump to be successful in North Carolina, I think this indicates there's got to be an appeal made to those voters, those college-educated voters that voted for Haley. The exit poll, I didn't put that chart up on here, but 63% of the people in the exit poll who had voted for Haley indicated they had severe hesitations about voting for Donald Trump in the fall. So the significant amount of work will need to be done by the Trump campaign among voters that were participants in the Republican primary, but that are not entirely enthusiastic about Donald Trump as their candidate. The other bar chart shows the percentage of voters again, looking at what Trump has to do in terms of independent-minded voters to win them over in the fall will be a considerable aspect of what the Trump campaign needs to do here in North Carolina if they hope to win. In the 2016 election, Donald Trump won North Carolina against Hillary Clinton by almost 4 percentage points. He defeated Joe Biden in 2020 by just about 1 percentage point. So I think the bottom line here is likely to be a very, very close race in North Carolina, thus the battleground designation that we receive. But for Trump to prevail, I think he's going to have a campaign that deals with this issue within the base of likely Republican voters who have some hesitation about his candidacy. So yesterday was Super Tuesday. A number of states voted. Most of them, all but Vermont, went for Donald Trump on the Republican primary there. So not quite enough delegates secured by Trump to guarantee he has to get 1,215 delegates to the Republican nominating convention to be guaranteed that he is the next candidate on the Republican ballot for president. He's a little over 900 now. I think by the end of the month, with the rest of the primaries that are on the schedule to take place, President Trump and probably also President Biden will have secured enough secured delegates to their two different parties' nominating conventions to be considered the very likely nominee for their party. So it looks at this point very much like a rematch from 2020 between Joe Biden and Donald Trump is in the way. Questions following Nikki Haley, who went into Super Tuesday, sort of this would make it or break it. If she did not do well on the ballots in these states on Super Tuesday, what would she do? Would she stay or go? Well, she announced this morning at 10 a.m. that she's suspending her presidential campaign, did not endorse Donald Trump, said that he would have to win over her supporters, and so hasn't yet said she definitively is endorsing his candidacy. So we'll see if anything else emerges over the next few weeks relative to former governor and UN Ambassador Haley's decisions relative to her position. The other question was, of course, having lasted this long into the contest, would she be considered a candidate for vice president? Not entirely sure that's a possibility. I think there's a better than even chance that Donald Trump will select a woman to be the vice presidential candidate with him in the Republican on the Republican ballot in the fall. A couple of choices there that are likely prospects, but I don't think it's likely that it's Haley, although I think she will have some influence over who it is, at least in part, if indeed she's able to leverage her ultimate endorsement of Trump by having some sway over the decision he makes on things like who he selects for vice president. Does that make her a front runner for 28? Is she now considered to be the front runner? Well, this will be, it should Donald Trump prevail in the fall, this will be his final term. That will be his second term as president. So in all likelihood, I think it does put Nikki Haley in a very good position, no matter what she does, whether or not she endorses Donald Trump, to be considered a Republican front runner for 28, although 4 years is a lifetime in politics. And so whether or not she can hold the kind of attention of the public over the 4 years, should Donald Trump or even Joe Biden be president, and to be considered a front runner in 28, we'll have to see. Not a given, but definitely something she might want to pursue. Okay. As we said, it looks like a rematch from 2020. This is from a recent Reuters Ipsos poll. I thought this was interesting. Bobby Kennedy Jr. is running as an independent candidate. He's still struggling to get on the ballot, to qualify and be certified to appear on the ballot for all 50 states and the District of Columbia and American protectorates. The national polling, when Bobby Kennedy Jr. is given as an option, generally speaking, Donald Trump is ahead somewhat on the average of all national polls relative to voter choices between the candidates that are identified as prospective presidential folks. And Bobby Kennedy is about 15%, sort of where a high-profile, recognizable name third-party candidate would be in the, at least by standards of recent American political history in presidential contests. I think these are the key points in the presidential race, as you see. There is a strong feeling, even among very loyal Democratic voters, that Joe Biden is too old, and is reflected in the polling. Biden at 81, it would be the oldest president ever if he wins re-election. This is a challenge, and it may become a very strong undercurrent for both candidates in this election, is their relative age, and the fact that even people within their own party are uncertain and unsure that somebody of that age should be president of the United States. Bobby Kennedy is younger, much younger than these two gentlemen, but I don't know that that's enough to spur on strong support for Bobby Kennedy. But it is interesting that somebody with that kind of recognizable name stays in the race as at least a probable third-party option for folks of both parties who just don't want to support a candidate who is as old as these two candidates are. But again, we'll see how this issue emerges. Now, the one thing that I can imagine that might alter this course of action, that Donald Trump and Joe Biden end up not being the nominees of their two parties, might be a health-related issue for one or both of these gentlemen. So, again, we'll have to see how that issue plays out in terms of the contest. Real quick, looking back for purposes of evaluation, if you take the results in North Carolina in the 2020 election, where Donald Trump wins, very narrow margin of the popular vote, the correlation between populational density and the performance of Democrat and Republican preference among voters is pretty significant. As you can see here, of all the counties that Joe Biden won, the ones in blue, the relative level of intensity of that support is shown in the various shades of blue. But of all the counties that Joe Biden won, the average populational density in those counties is almost 443 people per square mile. And in the counties where he won the biggest, more than 20 percentage points in his victory, the population density is almost 564 people per square mile. So the greater the concentration of population, the more likely it was that Joe Biden was win. The opposite is true for Donald Trump. The counties that he won, relatively modest populational concentrations. And so one of the dynamics in North Carolina, what I think is going to matter the most, is as the state continues to grow, and we do at about 100 and 120,000 new residents each year, we are becoming an increasingly densely populated state, at least among the I-85 corridor, and increasingly in places like Wilmington and Asheville, even in Watauga County, where there's a growing population. It's just a factor in American politics that if you live in a more densely populated place, the probability is more likely that the people that get elected are Democrats. And the opposite is true for less densely populated parts of the state. But as the state continues to grow, the density can only continue to grow. So this may be one of the more significant factors in terms of changing how this map looks after the 2024 election in terms of which counties Joe Biden wins and which counties Donald Trump wins. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about, as we get into the congressional and state legislative races, about the partisan ratings of districts. And I thought it would be helpful to explain this. Sometimes it's misunderstood. But so imagine this. There's two candidates running, the Bugs Bunny candidate and the Mickey Mouse candidate. And in a statewide race, the Bugs Bunny candidate gets 53% of the vote, and the Mickey Mouse candidate gets 47% of the vote. Well, in a particular district, those two candidates, Bugs Bunny got 58% of the vote, and Mickey Mouse got 42% of the vote. So by comparison with the result in that same contest, the Bugs Bunny candidate did better in that particular district. Well, a partisan rating is really only a reflection of the calculation of the likelihood of voters based on historical voting patterns to support a candidate of one party or the other as a function of what's the percentage above the statewide total in that race that was experienced by those candidates in that particular district. So for this example, you would say that the Bugs Bunny candidate in that particular district has a +5 advantage, meaning the voters in that district are likely to support a Bugs Bunny candidate 5% greater than the Bugs Bunny candidate is experiencing in terms of the total turnout statewide. So when we talk about a district leaning Republican or leaning Democratic, it's really just that calculation of what we've seen over the past several statewide contests in terms of voters there and their preference for either Democrats or Republicans as a function of the comparison between the results where they live with the statewide totals for those candidates. So just a real brief explanation for why we describe a particular district as being likely to produce an incumbent of one party or the other. Okay, we'll start with the federal races and the congressional 14
Joe,
districts. Yeah.
before you move on, we did have a question just come in through the Q&A.
Sure.
And it says, it seems that it is a foregone conclusion that Trump versus Biden will be the November ticket. What is your thought regarding how Trump legal issues may or may not impact this?
Yeah, it as much as any trial that a candidate would have to be a participant in would distract from the activities of campaigning, that there is that potential that it takes Donald Trump, in effect, off the campaign trail to have to be in the courtroom for these various criminal proceedings that are taking place. That there is some polling and talking to some political consultants of both parties, some sense that should there end up being a conviction, whether or not there is a conviction in the calendar year of the election year, that there an actual conviction might impact some portion of likely Trump supporters. They might make the decision to not support Trump if he was convicted by a court of one of these offenses. And so that the actual result of the trial could have some impact. The Constitution is very specific about the qualifications for president. You have to be a natural citizen, and that's it. You know, you can be a convicted felon, and you can actually even be incarcerated as a person and be elected president of the United States. There's no exclusion to that. It gets a little complicated, as it were, should that become a dynamic in any of this. But I think if the question is what I think, to some extent, so far, there's not been any indication that these trials are going to proceed in such an expeditious fashion as to produce a result before November 5th. And so I don't know how much it will directly impact the election at this point. Should one of these cases proceed quicker and they come back with a either guilty or not guilty verdict, that would certainly have some impact. And I think a not guilty verdict would have a tremendous boost to the Trump efforts. But other than just the logistics of having to be in court, I'm not entirely sure. We'll talk a little bit more about this too. People are so entrenched behind their candidates, both sides now, that, you know, Donald Trump once famously said if you'd walked out on Fifth Avenue and shot somebody, nobody would do anything about it. I mean, it was just his observation about the status that he had in American popular culture, I guess, for lack of a better way of thinking about it. But I think it's true. He was right. There's a certain amount of now people being locked in behind a candidate. So even the fact that the former president faces criminal charges is not as significant a factor in that many people's minds, loyal, dedicated Trump supporters. But even I'm convinced for a significant portion of people that are truly dedicated to voting for Donald Trump, even a conviction in a criminal case would probably not discourage them from supporting him. Okay, in the congressional races, 14 races. We had a few where the incumbent decided not to run again. Again, these are new districts drawn by the state legislature as a result of litigation. Kathy Manning in the 6th district and Wiley Nickel in the 13th district, incumbent Democrats chose not to run again. Patrick McHenry, an incumbent in the 10th district, just decided not to retire and not run anymore. Dan Bishop and Jeff Jackson both decided to run for attorney general, and now we'll face each other in November in that race. But the other races are sort of here, the coloration of the district, and there's the congressional district number, the counties that are contained in that district, and then the candidates that will face off against each other in November as a result of the primary. The coloration is an indication of that partisan preference of voters in that district. So purple, the 1st congressional district, is literally the only of the 14 congressional districts that is more or less an even match Democrats and Republicans in terms of voter performance. So that's the one district I would say where the outcome in November is probably in doubt and will be in large part affected by 3 things. Whatever's going on up ballot, the presidential and gubernatorial contest will have a dramatic impact. Outside money will come in support of the candidates, Democrat and Republican candidates in that particular district. And then just the 2 candidates themselves, their conduct of their campaign will make a big difference. So we'll go through these real quickly. The 1st congressional district, Don Davis, the incumbent there, former state senator, Lori Buckhout, career military officer, winning her Republican primary. These are really 2 qualified candidates. Really, both will be very strong, I think, in this election. So this will undoubtedly be not only a competitive race, a very competitive race. And the turnout of voters on both sides will make a big difference. If either Democrat or Republican voters are turning out less because they're uninspired by their presidential candidate, or something happens and they're not as excited about participating in the election as a result of something that happens in the presidential contest, could cast a long shadow over this race. This is really going to be a competitive race. 2nd district, very strong Democratic performance race. Deborah Ross, they're the incumbent, very likely to win in the fall. 3rd district, Greg Murphy, the Republican incumbent there, again, very strong Republican performance. 4th district, Valerie Foushee, former state senator, very likely to win in the fall. Virginia Fox in the 5th, longtime incumbent there, very likely to win in the fall. In the 6th district, in the Triad area, was an open seat race. That's the district Kathy Manning currently held, but the district is now more favorable to a Republican, as you might see. And in fact, no Democrat ran. So there is a runoff. Neither one of the top 2 vote getters got 30%. You have to get 30% or more to avoid a runoff. Addison McDowell, a relatively recent arrival to the election, a former Blue Cross lobbyist. And Mark Walker, who held the 6th congressional seat a while back when it was more favorable to Republicans, and run for the U.S. Senate as well. They will face off in the primary on May 14th against each other. The winner will be the winner because there is no Democrat in that race. And so the runoff is really the race. The 7th district, David Rouser, long-term incumbent there, very likely to win in the fall. The 8th district, also an open seat. This one, John Bradford, one of our IIANC members in the State House, was a candidate. Unfortunately, came in 3rd, was supported by InsurePAC, by the National Big I organization, very helpful and supportive of his campaign, but unfortunately came in 3rd. Mark Harris, the Republican candidate for a few cycles back, you may remember, was involved in a scandal and ultimately never held office, but has run again and just barely cleared the 30% threshold to avoid a runoff. But again, open seat race. There is a Democrat that he will face in the fall, but seemingly very likely that Mark Harris goes on to win that district and serve in Congress. 9th district, Richard Hudson, longtime incumbent there, very likely to win. Another open seat race in a very strong Republican district, Pat Harrigan, career military officer, had run for Congress and lost against Jeff Jackson last election cycle, ran in the Republican primary here and won over Gray Mills, a state house member, but again, a pretty strong Republican performance district. Mr. Harrigan very likely to win. Chuck Edwards beat Madison Cawthorn 2 years ago, is the incumbent here again. This is the least of the Republican leaning districts, leans the least of Republican of all of the Republican leaning districts, but still favors a Republican. So I think very likely that Chuck Edwards goes on to win in the fall. Alma Adams, a very strong Democratic performance district. She will have a Republican opponent, but I think she's safe she wins. 13th district, also an open seat, 11 candidates in the Republican primary here. No one got 30%, so there's a runoff. Kelly Daughtry, the daughter of a longtime state house member, Leo Daughtry, Brad Knott, relatively recent arrival to the political process, a former U.S. Attorney, worked in the U.S. Attorney's office. They will go to a runoff on May 14th. And again, given the partisan performance in that district, the winner of the runoff very likely to go on and win in the fall. And finally, the 14th district, State House Speaker Tim Moore winning the Republican primary there. And again, a district with a strong Republican performance history. And so very likely that Representative Moore goes to Washington as Representative Moore, just changing the NC to US in front of representative. So at this point, it seems like the only mystery left of the 14 districts, 3 are very likely to produce Democratic incumbents. 10 are very likely to produce Republican incumbents. And the question is in the first district, whether it goes one way or the other. The thing that matters in this regard is, of course, the balance of power in the U.S. Congress is relatively close. The Republicans hold a very narrow margin of currently among U.S. House members. And so picking up an additional district or 2 in a state like North Carolina could mean the difference between Republican or Democratic leadership in the U.S. House of Representatives. Moving on to the state races. In the contest for governor, no real surprises here. Josh Stein, the Democratic frontrunner, all the polling had showed that he was well ahead of his other rivals, winning with 70%. Mike Morgan coming in second, a former state Supreme Court justice. But Stein winning handily. Mark Robinson, equally considered the frontrunner on the Republican side, easily defeating his 2 other rivals, Dale Folwell, the current state treasurer, and Bill Graham, a trial lawyer from Salisbury, North Carolina, who had run for governor once before. But now Mark Robinson will go on to be the Republican nominee. 2 other gubernatorial candidates, Wayne Turner in the Green Party, he had no primary, and Mike Ross, who did have a primary in the Libertarian Party, was able to win against Shannon Bray. And so there will be 4 names in the gubernatorial contest in the fall. In the lieutenant governor's race, Rachel Hunt, the daughter of former Governor Jim Hunt, handily defeating Ben Clark, former state senator and congressional candidate, winning 70% of the vote. Very impressive. In the lieutenant governor's race, sort of interesting, Hal Weatherman, who was the chief of staff to the former lieutenant governor, and it had been a long-time candidate for lieutenant governor, working the state and visiting across North Carolina and campaigning for lieutenant governor for a long time. Jim O'Neill had run for statewide office in the attorney general's position before and ran for lieutenant governor this time, a district attorney in Forsyth County. Deanna Ballard, a former state senator who got drawn out of a state Senate district, had run, and I think there was some expectation that she would be able to at least get into the primary. But I think O'Neill's name recognition, even just from having run once before, helped. But this, again, neither one of the candidates got a 30%. So this will also go to a runoff in May 16th, May 14th. And the ticket will then be decided. Now, as everybody knows, governor, lieutenant governor run is separate. They don't run together in a ticket like president and vice president do, but there certainly is a lot of co-campaigning that goes on. So very likely to see whomever ends up being the Republican nominee for lieutenant governor campaign closely with Robinson and Hunt closely with Stein. In this matchup, this is, I think, by all accounts, it's easy to say this is one of the most, if not the most competitive governor's contest in the country this year. In just because North Carolina is a battleground state, very close on the partisan balance on a statewide basis. A lot of outside money is likely to come into North Carolina in support and opposition to these 2 candidates. The question is, how much influence does the up ballot race, the presidential contest, have on the gubernatorial contest? It is sort of an interesting dynamic. We had, when Roy Cooper, the current governor, ran the first time, there were people that voted for Donald Trump and then people that voted for Roy Cooper. And it appeared odd that we may have that again. There may be some people that feel as though Mark Robinson, the current lieutenant governor, as the Republican nominee for governor, has said some things that cause people some concern on issues that matter most and are important to them. And so they may choose to support Donald Trump and then support Josh Stein because they don't want to support Mark Robinson. That may be a dynamic. I'm not saying it will happen, but it could happen. There's some history of that kind of ticket splitting in North Carolina, and principally between federal races like president, U.S. Senate, and statewide races like governor. With this This is going to be an ugly race, I think, really ugly. And I think the Stein campaign is going to come right out of the gate now that the primary is over with some pretty serious, hard-edged attacks against Mark Robinson. Stein has a little bit of a competitive advantage currently in terms of finances, although I think at the end of the day, so much from outside groups is going to come into North Carolina. It is really going to devolve, my opinion here, it's really going to devolve pretty quickly into a real slugfest. The other statewide executive branch offices in state government, what we call our Council of State, is Secretary of State Elaine Marshall, the incumbent there, Chad Brown, the Republican nominee. There is now a runoff in the Republican primary for state auditor. This is Jessica Holmes, who was appointed to the position after Beth Wood resigned. Dave Bullock and Fred Clark are the two Republicans that will face off in the May primary. In the treasurer's race, this was an open seat race as the incumbent treasurer, Dale Folwell, ran in the Republican primary for governor. Briner is currently on the board of trustees at UNC Chapel Hill. Wesley Harris is a state representative from Mecklenburg County. In one of the surprising races, the superintendent of public instruction, the incumbent, Catherine Truitt, lost in the Republican primary to Morrow, who was a candidate only ever run once before for Wake County Board of Education. I believe that was it. Mo Green has just come out retired from the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. So this now, in effect, was not an open seat race, but becomes an open seat race in the fall. Very interesting dynamic there. And some of the dynamic from that is that there's a strong feeling about public education issues among the very conservative segment of the Republican voting base. And in part, there was some sense that Catherine Truitt, as a Republican superintendent, had not been rigorous enough on key issues that portion of the Republican voters segment really feel strongly about. And that explained Morrow's victory there. In the Attorney General's race, also an open seat race as a result of Josh Stein, the current Attorney General, running for governor. Bishop and Jackson, two current congressmen, running against each other. This race is also very likely to see a lot of outside money come in and be spent on both sides. Both of these gentlemen considered to be prospects for future higher office in their respective parties. I think there's a strong desire to see on both sides them elected so that the Attorney General's office is an opportunity to seek even higher office beyond that. This may be the race that gets far more attention than any other of these statewide races. And generally speaking, the Attorney General's race has a higher profile, but I think in this instance, it may be even greater than it is usually in that regard. Steve Troxler, the incumbent agriculture commissioner, generally the ticket leader among all statewide Republicans, does very well. I think it's likely he wins re-election. A little bit of a surprise here in the labor commissioner's race. I think only in as much as there was some sense that John Hardister, is a current House member from the Triad, had gotten the support of the current labor commissioner. But Jake Fraley, I think, worked very hard and gotten the endorsement of the previous labor commissioner, Cherie Berry. Braxton Winston, the former Charlotte City Council, really came into prominence in local politics in Mecklenburg County following some of the defund the police protests and such. But we'll see. I'm not sure. There's clearly two very distinctly different opinions about what the role of the labor commissioner would be, represented by these two candidates. The Republican candidate being far more of a business-oriented intended incumbent, where I think Winston would be far more of an activist and looking to use the office to promote an agenda relative to worker safety and such. The race that matters significantly to the community of IIANC members, Mike Causey, handily defeating his two Republican primary opponents, Andrew Marcus and Robert Brawley, I'm sorry. And then Natasha Marcus, the state senator from Mecklenburg, beating David Wheeler from Spruce Pine, North Carolina. So our matchup in the fall in the insurance commissioner's race is now known. And so we will continue to work to provide opportunities for our members to hear from both of these candidates about their position on key issues and their vision for the Office of Insurance Commissioner. We plan to try to do as much as is humanly possible to make available to our folks everything that would be helpful to you in helping to understand the choices you want to make in terms of the election of an insurance commissioner. The final statewide contest, our Supreme Court and Court of Appeals are elected statewide, and they're run on a partisan basis. Allison Riggs is an incumbent with an asterisk because she was appointed to fill the seat vacated by Mike Morgan. In his decision to run for governor, he vacated his Supreme Court seat. She defeated Laura Kubich, who was another Democrat who decided to run against her in that primary. She's won that. And then the only primary in any of the Court of Appeals seats, interestingly enough, Chris Freeman upset the incumbent. Not sure entirely what happened there. It's a down ballot race. It's sort of esoteric in terms of how judicial contests are handled. But so far in the last several election cycles, Republicans have fared very well in these statewide judicial seats. And so I think that's likely to continue on. Even in many instances, Republican candidates for the Supreme Court and Court of Appeals do better than even the Republican candidates for president or governor. Okay, shifting over to the state legislative races. Now, this is, again, the evaluation of the district based on historical voting patterns. And so the various relative partisan intensity there is measured by whether the seat's considered so safe. The Republican performance there is so significantly better than the Republican performance statewide. It's highly unlikely that a Democrat would win. The same true for safe Democrat. And I included in this chart, you can see, for example, in the column lean Republican, there are 5 legislative districts so rated. In all 5, there is a current Republican incumbent. And the reason why that matters is incumbency has a natural advantage in any election, just greater name recognition. So if indeed we were to have a dynamic where voters of one party or the other were choosing not to turn out for some reason, and it made it less likely for a Republican to be able to hold on to a district, even if it leaned in their party's favor, just because of significant attrition of voters of that party for one reason or another. But having incumbency, I think, sort of mitigates that in a certain set of circumstances that would mitigate it. But I think Republicans are very well positioned, even if there's not great performance among Republican voters in this election. Republicans are in a very good position to retain their majority. Currently, in the state Senate, there are 30 Republicans, and that is the number for supermajority, meaning they could override a gubernatorial veto on a party line vote. So they only need one. If Republicans win, all the districts that even just marginally lean Republican, they get 29 seats. So they would only need to win one of the seats that are either toss-up or lean a little Democrat. There aren't any that lean a little Democrat. If they win one of the toss-up seats, then they have a supermajority. And currently in the districts rated as toss-ups in the state Senate, there are 2 Republican incumbents. So I think it seems very likely to me at this point, outside of any extraordinary event or circumstance occurring, that Republicans are able to maintain their supermajority in the Senate. Just some of the legislative races of interest. These are open seat, and I include those only because open seats have a tendency, because there's no incumbent, they can go one way or the other sometimes just because there's not any of the candidate with the kind of name recognition among voters that is enjoyed by an incumbent. In the 3rd district, this was held by Jim Perry. Bob Brinson fended off in a Republican primary. Michael Speciale, a former House member. Brinson very likely to win that seat as a result. In one of those toss-up seats that is an open seat, not currently with a Republican incumbent, Scott Lassiter won the Republican primary there. Lassiter is the gentleman that sued House Speaker Tim Moore for alienation of affection as a result of a relationship Speaker Moore had with Lassiter's wife. But Lassiter, pretty strong, proven candidate. We'll see. Lisa Grafstein is an incumbent Democratic state senator in another district. As a result of redistricting, she was kind of left without a district, and so has moved into the 13th district and is running there. Also a proven campaigner and able to raise money. This should be a very competitive race, but one of those that has at least a potential of Republicans also picking up, in addition to the 2 toss-up districts where they already have an incumbent. In the 18th district, this is the one district Mary Wills Bodie decided not to run again. Terrence Everett, Democratic House member currently, decided to run in the state seat. Again, this will be a very competitive race in the fall, with lots of money, and probably lots of money from the Senate Republican caucus operation coming in support of the Republican candidate. The only other toss-up seat that had a primary there in the Mecklenburg County. Don't know much about these 2 candidates, quite frankly. But again, I think these will be races that Republican leaders focus on, feeling like these are good opportunities for them to pick up a seat because it's open and hold on to their supermajority margins in the state Senate. All right, shifting over to the House. As you can see, same sort of ratings, the same indication of where there are incumbents of either party. The way the districts are drawn, there are 69 that have some preference for the Republican candidate. 69, it takes 72 to get to a supermajority in the House. And so 3 need to be picked up. So Democrats in leaning districts, there are currently 3 Republicans serving in districts that lean Democratic. And in the toss-up, there are 2 Republican incumbents. And so again, in the same way with the Senate, if you look at this just from a purely analytical standpoint, Republicans in a very good position to maintain their supermajorities in the House. And again, just some of the races, in part because they're open seat races. These are all pretty strong candidates. I think these will be competitive races for the Republicans, even in the districts that have a tendency to lean even slightly to the Democrats' favor. John Blust, I'll point out this one. John Blust, a former House member who decided to run again because he was upset about the proposal to expand the number of casinos operating in North Carolina specifically, made the decision to run again for the state House based on that. And again, just some of these races that were open seats, and another toss-up in Mecklenburg County. The fact that there is a toss-up race in the Senate and the House in the Mecklenburg County probably mean just a lot more attention focused on Charlotte, even though the Mecklenburg delegation has a tendency to be overwhelmingly Democratic, again, sort of tying back to that correlation between population density and partisan performance. We might see a lot more Republican campaign activity taking place in Mecklenburg as a result of this. In these very divisive times, there is acrimony within both parties, Democrats against Democrats. These 4 faced a primary challenge in their own party, in large part because they had voted with Republicans in a number of instances during the last session, and so faced an opponent from within their own party. The 3, Willingham, Brockman, and Cunningham, were able to fend off their primary opponent. Michael Ray, unfortunately, lost by 42 votes to his Democratic opponent in the primary there. And so it's a district that has a pretty strong Democratic performance and not likely to change the ultimate composition on a partisan basis of the state House. But Representative Ray, it's close enough. He can call for a runoff, but very rarely do call for a recount, but very rarely do recounts result in a different outcome. But Representative Ray has been a strong supporter on a number of insurance-related issues that we've worked on. We hate to see him leave the legislature, but that was an instance where Democrats went up against Democrats. Similarly, for Mike Woodard, a state senator in Durham County, had voted with Republicans on a number of issues, including the state budget, and had run for mayor of Durham last year, but did decide to try to retain his state Senate seat and lost that in large part as a result of what was described as his cozy willingness to work with Republicans on issues. A little bit of this happened also in the Republican Party, where George Cleveland, a longtime House member from down in Jacksonville, was defeated in his party's primary. And Representative Crutchfield also, similarly. I'm not entirely sure looking at this. It probably, as much as anything, is that element of anti-establishment orientation among voters of both parties that may have contributed, at least in part, these incumbents losing their seats to other challengers from within their own party. So there's the whole thing. That's both chambers, and no different than the 2 separate charts. But again, I think it seems fairly likely, all things being equal, unless something dramatic happens in the presidential or gubernatorial contest, there is a distinct possibility Republicans come back with supermajorities in January of 2025, meaning that even if Josh Stein was to win the governor's contest and thus be able to veto legislation with supermajorities, the Republicans could override those vetoes. And so of course, anything can happen, and that's the beauty of politics. But at this point, I think it seems like a better than even bet that Republicans retain supermajorities in both chambers. Now, as we get ready to wind down, talk a little bit about some of the factors I think will be relevant in this election cycle. This is some recent polling relative to what issues voters are most concerned about. Again, what motivates and drives voters is what they feel are the pressing topics that impact them personally, and which of the candidates they feel is most likely to best address those issues. Inflation, a significant driver of voter interest at this point, people feeling the pinch primarily at the grocery store, where inflationary pressure is really being felt by working class families. Continued healthcare remains a residual issue. The issue of immigration, I think, has the potential to even rise up. And again, remember, this is an organic sense of issue. People may say inflation and prices matter most. And the next week, something may happen at the southern border, and now they suddenly feel immigration matters more. So this is fluid. It's not static by any stretch of the imagination. But the thing that I always say is voters, American voters, always vote on economic issues unless they don't, unless something replaces economics because it's so pressing. And generally, it's either a national security concern or crime and criminal activity that displaces economic issues in a favorable economic environment. So part of the challenge is the economic indicators are pretty good. I mean, the overall economy, even as odd and complex as it is, where we're having very low unemployment rates, but we're still seeing layoffs, and some complexities still remain in the aftermath of the pandemic in terms of employers and thinking about the nature of remote work. The economy overall, by objective measures, is in pretty good shape. The interesting thing is, in politics, generally speaking, favorable economic conditions are beneficial to the incumbent. People believe that the person in office now is responsible for the good economic news. That is not translated for Joe Biden. And unlike other presidents in recent history, Biden does not get credit in the way that other presidents did for the current state of the economy. And so it may not be an issue that the president's able to champion as a candidate for president for reelection, because people don't see President Biden as the reason for whatever sense of economic prosperity they're enjoying. So I do think there's a greater likelihood crime and criminal justice and immigration issues really relevant to what's going on at our southern border are likely to emerge. Abortion continues to be an issue, and Democrats feel very strongly that is a motivating issue for them, principally among women voters. And so that may see some greater ascendancy as we get closer to election day in November. But at this point, still, inflation is a significant issue, and that may be why people do not feel President Biden is responsible for the good news, is that they're feeling this economic pinch at the grocery store and hold him accountable for that. Young voters now, the youngest three segment of American generational cohorts, occupy the role of more than half of the registered voters in this country and more than half the registered voters in North Carolina, but they don't participate at the same rate as older voters. So their influence is not as strong as the numbers might indicate. The question is, are they motivated or unmotivated? And some of the polling that I've read among younger voters are very disappointed that they're likely to vote for Democrats, but they feel disappointed that the Democratic nominee for president in all likelihood is an old person, and they would rather have it be someone younger. And that may influence whether or not young people are enthusiastic or not. A big dynamic in every election is what's called the enthusiasm gap. Are voters of one party or the other more or less likely to turn out because they're really excited about doing so and supporting their candidate for president? I think for Democrats, the challenge is, how do you get principally young people that have been historically the last couple of election cycles able to be convinced to vote for a Democratic candidate that they believed in, if they don't believe in that candidate because of their age? One of the other dynamics I think is interesting, this is from some recent polling relative to the issue sets and the partisan and ideological orientation of younger generation voters. The younger women are becoming more liberal in their disposition relative to voting performance, and they are more attuned to key issues than young male voters. Even though we see in the age cohorts, young men have a tendency to be more likely to identify as conservative and Republican, it's increasing in that gap among young women. And this may become a factor if an issue like abortion does become more significant in the weeks leading up to the November 5th election. This sense of entrenchment, this is another phenomena that we have to keep our eyes on. People feel very strongly they're sometimes not voting for a candidate as much as they're voting against the other candidate. And even what it means to be a Democrat, a Republican, or a conservative and a liberal is shifting. And the younger generation Americans significantly feel this. From the Gallup poll, this is the identification on a partisan basis based on various key demographic factors. As you can see, men and women sort of falling along the lines as they have usually in terms of their partisan disposition. But the one, as you see the chart on the left at the bottom, educational attainment becoming a more significant factor. Those without a college degree being more likely to support the Republican candidate, sort of the historic sense of working class, blue collar Americans, that population that did not have a college degree, were Democrats and that they had supported Democratic candidates for president for many years. That shift is really significant, and we've seen it manifest itself in the last two presidential contests. So the whole identity that people bring to the table in terms of their disposition as voters, whether they self-identify with one party or the other, or self-identify ideologically one place or another, all of those definitions may be under significant change. And just looking at the pure voter registration numbers in North Carolina, and again, the thing to remember is, of course, you can register as an unaffiliated, still vote in a partisan primary. You just have to pick one or the other. But the growth of the last 2 decades has been among unaffiliated voters. It's now the leading category. And we've seen a net loss of Democrats, modestly a net gain of Republicans, but a significant increase in the number of people that are registering as unaffiliated. And so this is the more significant trend. And the two things that I say are important to remember. One, registering unaffiliated doesn't mean you're not aligned with one party or the other. It's more like a dimmer switch. Your intensity of support for candidates of one party or the other may vary, but most of the political scientists I know say within that cohort of unaffiliated voters, it's really only somewhere around 10 to 12% that are truly independent and would vote for a candidate of either party. It's just the relative intensity within that cohort is pretty significant, but it is a reflection of the fact, and principally what's driven this increase in unaffiliated voter is younger people was they first register to vote when they turn 18 or just choosing not to identify as either Democrat or Republican. They may still have that leaning one way or the other. They just do not want to be recognized as that within their voter registration distinction. We do have some other parties coming on. The No Labels Party is a phenomenon. Former Governor Pat McCrory is attempting to bring that about as a way to take partisanship out of politics. I'm not sure that would ever be possible in America, but it's a noble ambition to get people to be a little less strident and more willing to work together to get problems solved. But we're just at a point in time in American history where I think people feel such tremendous passion about the issues. In large part, the world is changing. The dynamics of America in the world are very different. And so there is a lot of reaction and response to these sorts of conditions that reflect in American politics. This from a political consulting friend, Paul Shoemaker. He's tracked in polling self-identification. Are you a Democrat, Republican, or independent, unaffiliated? Are you conservative, liberal, or moderate? And so you see over time what's happened is self-identified Republicans on an ideological basis, the red line at the top, have remained pretty much conservative all along the decades since 1996. Democrats, on the other hand, self-identified here, have gone from being what you might consider right center conservative, even though they self-identified as Democrats, sort of traditional Southern Democrats, and they've become more liberal. So almost a 50-point swing in terms of the percentage of self-identified Democrats who describe themselves as being liberal. The state overall and the unaffiliateds remain pretty consistent over that decade, slightly more liberal in their identification, but still right center. If you take the state as a whole in terms of people's identification on ideological basis, and if you are considered yourself unaffiliated, you are more or less in lockstep with the ideological disposition of the state. But we are significantly shifting left overall, and some part of that is the increasing urbanization of the state. As we become a more densely populated state, these dynamics will significantly impact our politics as we become a slightly more liberal-leaning place than we have been historically. Okay, my final thoughts coming into the last minutes of the hour. North Carolina's a battleground state. And we're going to see a ton of money, $700 or $800 million probably when it's all said or done, spent not just by the candidates, by outside groups. You're going to see the presidential candidates a ton during this election. You're going to see a lot of fierce ads, a lot of attack ads, a lot of outside groups bringing in money. Sell your agency, buy a TV station. That's where the money's going to be made. And increasingly, candidates directly communicating with voters through social media and digital advertising. So even your favorite internet spaces will be overtaken by political ads in this election cycle. Just the nature of being such a competitive place, we're going to see a ton of political activity this election cycle. And that's all going to be a ton of money with it. And a lot of it is high wealth individuals. It's not necessarily the two parties. It's individuals that have strong partisan orientations themselves that come in support of or opposition to a particular candidate. And again, $700 or $800 million. It's unbelievable to me that much money, you could do some good with that much money. I hate to see it all spent in politics. But I think the contest, the presidential and the gubernatorial contest, and probably a number of the other statewide races will be very close. I do think, absent something happening between now and election day, I just think we are going to live up to our reputation as a battleground state. We could see 5.5 million votes cast of the 7-point-something million voters, and it would be the margin of victory less than 25,000 votes. I mean, it could be that close, very, very close. And again, the only thing in politics that's certain is its uncertainty. World conditions, anything could happen. North Korea could launch a missile, and suddenly everything is about national security concerns. The predictions are starting to come out for a above average activity, a hurricane season this year. We could have a tremendous event occur in North Carolina or even somewhere else that further difficulty in the insurance marketplace as a result of such a significant catastrophic event. The other is, and I'll mention that a number of groups have now taken up the tactic of this issue of sitting in a highly congested roadway as a method of bringing attention to a particular issue. That this was done by some groups protesting the war in Gaza. This is, in my opinion, has the potential to lead to some sort of disastrous event where a motorist is enraged by this and does not stop for the group of people in the road. And we have some significant acts of civil disobedience as a result in major cities across the country, as we have experienced in the not too recent past. And my fear is this sense of entrenchment, this strong partisan divide in our country could result in some bad conduct among some people in the form of riots and civil distress, I guess, for lack of a better word, that leads to a greater sense of voters wanting to see a restoration of law and order. And so that's the one thing I feel might have the greatest potential to occur that could alter the landscape in terms of voter dispositions. And that's it. That's our hour. That's everything that happened yesterday and what I think might happen in the coming year. Appreciate you taking time to be a part of this today. Of course, we've recorded the session and we'll post it on to our 2024 elections website. So anybody that hadn't seen it or wants to see it again will be able to view this and see it. I'm always glad to answer individual questions. If anybody wants to email me or give me a call and talk a little bit about this again, our focus is on the insurance commissioner's race. We will, of course, be monitoring other key races like the governor's race, the attorney general's race, and all of the state legislative races. But this constituency, our members, we feel very strongly want to make sure they have a full understanding of everything about the two candidates running for insurance commissioner, and that's our commitment. We'll bring you that throughout the fall and leading up to Election Day in November. I'm glad to answer any other questions. Let's check the chat and see. No questions, just some nice comments. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. This is a service I like to provide to our members. This is, of course, a big part of my background, monitoring, following, and being involved in North Carolina politics. I think it's important as a regulated industry for us to understand this aspect of what's going on in North Carolina. And so I'm always glad to preach a little gospel about the various component parts of our politics and what does and doesn't influence the outcome. So without that, without any further ado, wish you well. Have a great day. I look forward to other opportunities to talk to you about things that are going on, and watch your mailbox for other programs, events, forums, and information that we'll provide throughout the election year.
Thank you.